Continuing education knows that at the end of the day, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we really listen to their needs, and we can offer them flexible options both within continuing education and across the campus.
We don't take a cookie-cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us at the 78th Annual Conference on World Affairs. My name is Jan Burton, and I'm a community activist, an arts enthusiast, an open space advocate, and I will be serving as your moderator. For recording purposes, today's date is Thursday, April 16th, 2026. The panel time is 11 a.m., and the panel title is If Not Roe, Then Joe. Control, Accountability, and Equity in Reproductive Policy. Now, before we get started, I'd like to read the University of Colorado Boulder's land acknowledgement. The University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We will do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, and faculty and their work, by educating, conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating indigenous knowledge, and by consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support, and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is both inclusive and respectful. Thank you once again for coming to the CWA today and today's discussion. We ask that all attendees remain respectful throughout the discussion and refrain from interruptions. Please silence your phones and your watches, which reminds me I need to do the same thing. Time will be allotted for questions at the end of this, but they'll be gathering questions throughout the whole panel. So if you have a question you'd like to ask, please raise your hand, and one of the producers in the back will bring you a note card and a pencil. And then if you'll give that back to them, they'll bring them to me, and I will go through the questions. In some cases, I might have to consolidate them. I will give preference to students. I see we have some students here, which is fantastic. And CWA always gives some preference to the students who come to our sessions. And now, I would like to ask our panelists to introduce themselves, and I remind our audience that full speaker bios can be found on the website or on the CWA app. Kate, would you like to kick it off, please?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. Happy Thursday. Yes. It's a long week. My name is Kate Schatz, and I am an author and an activist and a public speaker and an educator. I'm also a parent, but I'm here today, I guess, for all those reasons, actually. And I write a number of books. My most recent book is a novel that came out about a month and a half ago, so I'm actually on book tour right now. The novel's called Where the Girls Were. Oh, thank you, Lisa. And germane to this panel, oh, thank you. It's a novel, it's historical fiction. It's set in 1968, and yes, I'm sorry to tell you that 1968 is historical fiction, according to my publisher. And it's set long ago in 1968 in San Francisco, and it's a story of a teenage girl who gets pregnant and is sent to a home for unwed mothers. And it's about the kind of hidden history of maternity homes and what used to happen to young women who had unexpected pregnancies in the decades before Roe. It's inspired by my mom's own experiences in the 60s, being sent away and having to give up babies for adoption. And apparently there's only 4 copies left at the bookseller, so run, don't walk after the panel. But I'll just also say that my other books, which are nonfiction, are all, I'm a feminist author, and I focus on lesser known histories and stories, writing about the women and topics and histories that they don't want us to learn about.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. My name's Parker. I am a political consultant. I spent a big chunk of my career on Capitol Hill. I spent about 15 years as a chief of staff to a member of Congress who became part of leadership and a committee chairman. I then went more of a political route and ran a political committee that was in charge of electing members to the House, and since then essentially advise super PACs, organizations, and donors on political strategy and giving. And I'm excited to be here today, so thank you.
My name is Lisa Graves, and I lead True North Research, which is a watchdog group, and I also am the co-founder of Court Accountability, which works on reforms to the Roberts Court and of the courts to try to restore and expand our freedoms. My background is that I worked at the Justice Department. I was Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Office of Legal Policy, Office of Policy Development at the Justice Department under both Ms. Reno and Mr. Ashcroft. I was also the Deputy Chief of the U.S. Court System's Article III Judges Division, where I helped oversee the financial disclosure and ethics and anti-corruption measures for the U.S. courts. And then I was the chief counsel for nominations for the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee for Senator Patrick Leahy when he was the chairman and then the ranking member of the committee. And in that role, I worked intensively on nominations, but I actually worked on nominations at the Justice Department as well. And so I have looked at a lot of these issues through the lens of the courts, including in particular reproductive rights. And I had a brief stint in national security work and civil liberties, but then for the past 17 years, I've been investigating the right-wing infrastructure and how it has worked to change American policy at the national, state, and local level, and the sources of the funding steering those movements. And so that's my area of expertise, and I have a new book out. It's called Without Precedent. It's about John Roberts. The title is pretty direct. It says, How Chief Justice Roberts and his accomplices rewrote the Constitution and dismantled our rights. And it details the history of how we got here, both from the standpoint of Roberts' appointment and his decisions and the decisions he's orchestrated on the U.S. Supreme Court, as well as the forces that brought him to power going back decades. And so that's the source of the book, and it's now out on audio. I did a little bit of the audio, but not the whole thing. And I'm really excited to have the chance to be here with you all today and have this conversation about reproductive rights in America and where things stand and where things could be going.
Thank you, Kate, Parker, and Lisa. I think we have a wonderful panel. And I just met one of the people who was responsible for coming up with this panel and mentioned that there were no men on the panel. And she said that that was actually intentional in order to make the women on the panel feel safe and be able to speak completely openly. So if some of you are wondering about that as well, that's the reasoning. So I'm going to kick this off with the question that is actually on the app, which is, can regulation of men's bodies yield better outcomes in sex, health, and safety, and reproductive freedom? And I would ask any one of you to kick that off and maybe riff off of each other, or I'll have some other questions.
Oh, I'll go first, everyone. Well, first I will say I too noticed the lack of men on this panel, and I would feel absolutely safe and comfortable speaking my mind and saying anything I wanted if there was a man on this panel. Which is not a critique for the organizers, who put the panel together. But frankly, I mean, it's high time that we involve men in these conversations. It's beyond time. In fact, I would love to see panels next year about epidemics of male violence and toxic masculinity. And I'd love to see a panel of men up here talking about why we continue to see over and over abuses of power, sexual assault from men. I want to see men talking about how they can stop rape. I want to see men talking about how to teach our sons, how to teach our boys. The onus has fallen on women to have these conversations over and over. I'm a lifelong feminist. I've been talking about this my whole life, but it's high time. So that said, the question that you're posing is so interesting because the question is about the regulation of men's bodies. So my answer is no, because what I'm opposed to is the regulation of our bodies, right? As someone who's deeply pro-choice and has been my entire life, what I want is to stop the regulation of our bodies. I want to stop the regulation of women's bodies when it comes to reproductive health, right? I want to stop it when it comes to the medical choices that we want, right? And so I don't want to regulate men's bodies. Do I want birth control to be funded and available for men? Absolutely. And I have plenty to say about that. Do I want vasectomies to be free or low cost? Absolutely. I have plenty to say about that. But I don't want any more bodies to be regulated any more than they already are.
Thank you, Kate. Either one of you would like to comment on that?
I mean, I largely agree, actually, with a lot of what Kate said. It may be obvious coming more from a center-right perspective among my friends here on the panel, but from a conservative standpoint, am not in favor of greater regulation of anyone's bodies either. And I do think that it is important for men to be more involved in these choices. I'm sure there are nuances on which we might not agree, but I think in that, sort of 10,000-foot view, I fully support that.
I agree. So we can just all go home. We've reached agreement. There's harmony. There's peace in the world. But I do think that the question of regulating people's bodies and who gets to regulate your body, and my answer is you yourself. That is a real question of freedom, and it's not just freedom from a libertarian standpoint. It's also freedom from a progressive standpoint. What does it mean to be free? It means that someone cannot force you to carry a pregnancy to term, whether it's the product of rape or rape by incest, or that you've decided not to continue this pregnancy. A lot of people don't realize that most abortions, most people who have abortions are people who have children already. They've made a decision about their lives, about their families, and how large they want their family to be. Some people obviously have abortions who've never had a child and never do have a child, and I think that the ability to control your destiny, to make a decision about your future, your dreams, and not have some legislator in some state house who knows nothing about you, knows nothing about your family, knows nothing about your circumstances, dictate what you can do on the advice of your physician is fundamentally outrageous and deeply destructive of human autonomy.
So a follow-on question then, where should the line be drawn between bodily autonomy and state interest, regardless of gender?
Ooh, I went first last time.
I recognize that this may not be a popular opinion here, but I do think that it is a more complicated question for a lot of people who believe that, in good faith, I think, that there is another life involved in this situation. And I know that not everyone agrees with that standpoint, and I understand that, but I think it is important to acknowledge that views on abortion in this country are complicated. They're nuanced. A lot of voters find themselves somewhere in the middle, where they think there should be some right or ability to terminate a pregnancy, but that is not an unlimited right. And so that's my, I don't know where that line is. That has been the subject of endless debates, but I just sort of wanted to acknowledge that I think it's important to recognize that a lot of people come to those views in good faith and not because they just want to subjugate women. So that was my thought.
I agree with that, Parker. And some people do come to that from the standpoint of wanting to subjugate women. So both are true. And I think that, one of the things that's happened in this country with the Roberts Court's actions in overturning Roe versus Wade and the effort to get that case overturned has been an extraordinary amount of disinformation about abortion in America. The reality is that decision, Roe versus Wade, a 7-2 decision, 7-2, written by a Republican appointee to the court, an appointee of Richard Nixon. His name was Harry Blackmun. He'd been a senior legal advisor to the Mayo Clinic. That Roe versus Wade decision set out a framework for assessing this very question. At what point does the state have an interest in regulating a pregnancy, and at what point must the state refrain? And that was the trimester system, which said in the first trimester, when the embryo or fetus is not viable, cannot survive outside the womb, the state has the least ability to interfere in that decision to terminate that pregnancy. In the second trimester, where viability is still not possible in most instances, and certainly not in 1972, and even to this day, mostly not viable pregnancies, the state could assert some interest in trying to sort of balance this equation. And then in the third trimester, when a fetus could be born and survive, the state had its strongest interest in this regulation question. But even then, there were decisions, including from the US Supreme Court before the Roberts Court, where they recognized that in the case of a late-term abortion, that there were circumstances that perhaps could allow those to proceed. And that included, a woman who is diagnosed with cancer, who has a terminal illness, who is making the hardest decision of her life, and her family is embroiled in the hardest decisions of their lives, or they get a diagnosis about fetal viability in terms of the health of the fetus and the lifespan, if any, of that child to be. And those decisions, I would never dare to intrude on the most difficult decisions any family would face. And in fact, this has been a long time part of the anti-abortion movement, has been to mostly talk about late-term abortions, even though they're exceedingly rare, and portray them, as Trump has, as, I invoked his name, I'm so sorry. Where are the frogs? I don't know. But anyway, this idea of post-birth abortion, of infanticide, has been the mythology, the threat, the fear, the claim on some people. I'm not suggesting Parker at all, but in some parts of this movement. And the reality is that that is not a thing that is happening in America. What's happening is that there are people who are facing the worst circumstances of their life, and many of them have carried that pregnancy to that far because they desperately want a child, and they're being told by their physicians, if they do not terminate this pregnancy, not only may they not survive, but if they did survive, they may not have the ability to have children in the future ever again. And I myself would not want to intervene and inject myself in someone else's decision about their life or their death in that moment. But the reality is that this court has also deeply misconstrued that ruling. John Roberts, subject of my book, attacked the notion of viability as even a fair standard for assessing the weighing of the regulation of these rights. Sandra Day O'Connor, who came to the court appointed by Ronald Reagan, worked on a decision back in 1992. It was called Planned Parenthood versus Casey. And she affirmed Roe versus Wade along with her fellow justices. And along with that, she added to the test, the viability test, a notion of undue burden. So if a state places an undue burden on the exercise of this right to access abortion, that would be impermissible. And what had happened in that case was that in Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania legislature, largely white male legislature, decided to impose a requirement of husband notification. And there were only a few exceptions if you'd actually filed a criminal report basically against your husband. But instead, the exceptions were very few and very unlikely to be used. And so it went to the Third Circuit, And Justice Alito, before he was a judge, was on that circuit, and he defended that case, even though the factual findings of the court below were that there are all these ways that a husband could pressure a wife to continue a pregnancy. He could, block access to money, deny access to finances. He could humiliate his wife to her family and her friends by disclosing her desire to make this private decision about the pregnancy. He could threaten her. He could threaten her children. He could threaten to take away her children. And Alito disregarded all of those concerns and in his part would have ruled in favor of the Pennsylvania law. But the US Supreme Court, when Sandra Day O'Connor was on the court, rejected that law and said that those things would impose an undue burden. So we had a very sensible framework for this regulation question, and it was completely upended by the US Supreme Court in the Dobbs decision, which was written by Sam Alito, who told the American people when he was nominated that he respected precedent and would follow the law, and yet he'd been harboring throughout his career at the Justice Department and as a judge on the Third Circuit, and then obviously as a Supreme Court judge, this hostility to this legal precedent in Roe versus Wade, and he had the audacity in that decision to even cite as worthy of credit a man from like 600 years ago who was a witch hunter as authority for the notion that abortion has always been illegal and a crime. It has not. Other historians have noted that this has not been the norm in US law or even in the historical law before then. But the fact is that we had a framework that worked, but some people, some very rich people and people with access to a lot of capital like Leonard Leo, who helped pack the court, worked to pack the court in order to overturn Roe versus Wade.
Thank you, Lisa. I want to go back, because I'm so glad you mentioned this, just because I'm also obsessed with like these historical fun facts that so many of us don't realize. And so I just want to go back to the beginning, because I really think a lot of people don't realize that the trimester system, if you are pregnant and you're talking to your doctor and you're talking about what happens in your body in your different trimesters, that is not a concept that comes from medicine. That comes from the Supreme Court. That comes from the Roe decision. I think so many people don't realize that. I just think that's like a really fascinating aspect, again, when we think of how many aspects of our bodies, of healthcare, of medicine come from these kind of decisions. And, I also want to just say, Parker, I don't get a lot of opportunities to sit next to and engage in conversation about this with someone who doesn't share my views, and I actually really value it. And I think one of the things for me about abortion is that, again, it's something I believe in so deeply. And it's also one of the kind of controversial topics where I think I feel the most compassion and empathy for people who don't share my viewpoint. And I am actually not at all invested in changing anybody's mind about abortion. Like, I really respect a person's opinion who doesn't agree. And that's really true. And I don't feel that way about all of the things I hold strong opinions about. I really understand. And I really also think that because of the attacks on abortion, the attacks on women's rights, we have become, those of us who are fighting for choice and access, we're really kind of cornered in that it becomes dangerous to have nuanced conversations about it, right? It becomes dangerous to acknowledge in public that abortion can be traumatic, right? Abortion, there are women who regret having their abortion. Abortion can be really, really difficult for people. It can, and it's okay to say that out loud, right? And it also saves lives, right? It also liberates people. For many people, it's also something that they do and they don't think about again. It is complicated, it is nuanced, and it is also a medical procedure, right? And when we're talking about birth control, when we're talking about abortion, we are talking about healthcare, we're talking about science, we are talking about medical procedures that should be regulated by the governing bodies of medicine, by the American Medical Association, although who did ultimately begin the process to criminalize abortion in the 19th century. But that's who should be making these decisions, and then ultimately it should be us making these decisions for what we want to do with our bodies.
Parker, would you like to respond at all, or should I ask you a follow-up question? One thing that I've wondered about for a long time, and I hope this doesn't seem too pointed, Parker, but the Republican Party often professes that less government is better, that government should stay out of people's lives, less taxation, all this. But on the subject of this, you know, they're right there in the middle of legislating people's lives. How do you rationalize that as a policy person?
Yeah, and I do want to acknowledge that my own views on this are complicated. I would not describe myself necessarily as pro-life, but I do feel like I'm clearly here to sort of represent that side of things. I just think it continues to be this fundamental disconnect, which makes this topic so difficult, which is that, and I recognize that not everyone acts in good faith, but Republicans of good faith truly, truly believe that this is a life. And so any decision about abortion automatically becomes complicated because there are many people that believe from the moment of conception that that is a life. A lot of those views. And I think that's why, and again, I am acknowledging that not everyone acts in good faith on this topic, but I think a lot of the people that I worked with that believed very strongly in this way did believe in good faith that that was a life. And so they looked at that as preventing murder, frankly. And so, you know, again, it's complicated, but that is, they don't think of that as a regulation of the mother in the same way. They think of it more as a protection of a baby.
I would like to say respectfully that a lot of things are complicated. I mean, right? And we all have a lot of really different beliefs. I don't believe that we should make policy based on belief, right? I mean, I think that we should make policy based on, I also have a lot of really strong beliefs. And I don't think we should make policy based on all of my strong beliefs, actually, because that's counter to life and liberty and freedom. And so this idea that we come back to about belief, even if it's good faith, again, with all due respect, belief is not how we're creating law for this country. And I do want to make sure that we expand our conversation as well to not just be about abortion. We have strong feelings about abortion, but when we're talking about reproductive rights and policy, right now what we're seeing, I mean, we've already seen Dobbs. Right now we're seeing the escalation of criminalization of women who have miscarriages. Women are dying in emergency rooms because doctors can't do life-saving procedures because in several states, in many states, I think up to 17 states, they could be charged with murder, right? So people are dying here. But we're also seeing the regulation of birth control, right? This is some white Christian nationalist movement here. That is what is happening. And we are seeing attacks on birth control. We are seeing so much more than just abortion. So when we really narrow our focus on abortion, we're losing the full scope of actually what is happening here.
So a follow-on question. Do you want to jump in, Lisa?
If I could just jump in on that. You know, I think that this issue has been dramatically politicized over time. A lot of people don't recall or weren't there or don't remember that actually when Roe versus Wade came down, there were evangelical church leaders who supported it. It was condemned by the Catholic Church as contrary to the doctrines of the Catholic Church at the time and to the present moment, although even if you look at the polling in the United States, a majority of Catholics support the ability to access abortion, even if they themselves would not make that decision. Overwhelmingly in the United States, the majority of people support access to abortion, again, whether they themselves would choose to do so or not. But that politicization has had wide impacts, as Kate was mentioning, in terms of people who are dying in parking lots because they can't get a D&C, they can't have a common procedure because the doctors and the lawyers for the hospitals are afraid that they could be charged with crimes. Because even though the abortion movement has stepped back for the most part on trying to criminalize women and girls for having abortions, there's a wave of laws in the states to criminalize someone who gives someone an abortion. And there are even measures that were adopted in Texas to have like a bounty basically, for turning people in, which is extraordinary, and also the assertion that you can't drive along the highways, to leave the state to get an abortion someplace else. A long time ago, I looked into this issue in particular, this external application law issue, because in Ireland, which now has legal abortion, but back then in the 1990s did not, they were trying to criminalize people who would leave to go to England to get an abortion. And there was a case involving a 12-year-old girl who was the victim of rape/incest. And the question was, could she leave the country to get an abortion? And I said at the time that this was coming to the United States, that there would be an effort to criminalize abortion, and it would not just affect your ability in that state to have an abortion, but it would affect the right to travel, which is one of the only rights that's actually guaranteed in the main body of the Constitution, to travel. The idea that you cannot travel to get an abortion in another state where it's lawful, which would be like, if you want to leave your state that may not legalize pot, you couldn't actually come to Colorado to get pot. That would somehow be a crime. Why, that would be outrageous. That's absurd. But that's what these abortion laws are trying to do in some of these states, to try to prevent women from even traveling. Now, the reality since around the time of Dobbs, and certainly since then, is that most abortions in the United States are not surgical abortions, they're medicine abortions. And so there's been an effort by the right to criminalize access to mifepristone and a related drug that is used in that first trimester of pregnancy to end a pregnancy. And there's been an effort by some states, like in Texas, with attorneys general who are tied to Leonard Leo, to this movement to try to use the courts and the law to limit people's access. There's been an effort by Texas to try to criminalize the sending of those access to those abortion pills. The reality since Dobbs is that more women are having abortions than before Dobbs, and they're doing so through medicine, but in some states it's dangerous legally to figure out how to access that medicine. But I want to just conclude on one point that Kate raised, which is about opening the conversation about contraception, because this Supreme Court has also weighed in on those issues, in particular in a case called the Hobby Lobby case, where the Roberts Court decided that a corporation had a religious belief that was sufficient to overcome the interests of its employees, the clerks at Hobby Lobby, who under the Affordable Care Act would otherwise have access to contraception. And the Hobby Lobby claimed that it had, as a corporation and a family-owned business, a religious belief to deny its clerks access to the pill or the IUDs, intrauterine devices, to prevent the implantation and to prevent pregnancy. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of Hobby Lobby. It allowed this corporation to assert that its corporate desire to prevent access to contraception based on this family's claimed biblical beliefs would trump the ability of ordinary women, human beings, to access contraception through the ACA. Now, I've read the Bible from cover to cover twice, and there is nothing in the Bible really about contraception. There's one line about basically masturbation, but I don't see the regulation of masturbation on the horizon for anyone. And I personally would not endorse it. I'm just saying, like, that's the only reference in the Bible to contraception, is spilling your seed, right? That's to you men, to the topic of the panel. But the reality is that the Bible does have some very clear commands in the Ten Commandments, including thou shalt not steal. And shortly after this ruling for Hobby Lobby that Alito orchestrated and told, apparently, according to reports, evangelical leaders that he was about to do so, he was about to rule for them. There's a big investigation report about this. What happened next was that Hobby Lobby was charged with stealing artifacts from the Middle East, millions of dollars of artifacts, and it paid fines for doing so. And it was on notice that these artifacts from the Middle East, from Iraq and other places, were not lawfully obtained. And it's still, that company and its founders, its family, still accepted those stolen goods. And so what I would say to you is, how is it possible that the court could recognize a non-existent ban in the Bible for a company that actually had no regard for the actual explicit command of the Bible, thou shalt not steal?
Thank you, Lisa. I'm getting tons of questions now, which is great. This is going to take a little different turn. I'm going to focus on student questions, and this one is, do you think parents should have a say in women's pregnancy choices? On that, should parents be informed if their daughters get an abortion, as in some parents' ideas could influence what that person truly wants? That's a tough question.
I'm just going to jump right in and say, so there's an interesting thing that happens, and I don't know if it's like this in every state, but when my kids turned 13, I could no longer access their all their medical records in my chart, like in our online thing, right? And it actually really surprised me. At first, I was like, wait, how can I? Where's the stuff about my daughter's vaccines? I can't see it anymore. And I will confess that at first I was frustrated just because it added like another layer of logistics to my life as a parent. But I really understand it. This is controversial, but I'm just going to say no. I do not believe that parents have the right to be told if their child accesses an abortion, because there are in many cases that could threaten the person who accessed the abortion, that could threaten their life, that could threaten their safety. Not every young person lives in a house where they feel safe. They might live under violence. And in fact, that abortion could be the result of something that happened inside of the house, right? So absolutely not. I would like to believe that if one of my children was going to need an abortion or need to support a person who is going to access abortion or needs to access birth control, that they would come to me, because I hope that I've created a home where they feel safe. But I don't believe that it's my right as a parent to know that information. That's between the child and the healthcare practitioner. Yeah. And I say that as someone whose daughter is in the audience today, so sorry to put you on the spot, dear.
I mean, I think that there should be a workaround, but my daughter can't get her ears pierced, she can't get a tattoo, she can't undergo a medical procedure. Obviously, if you are able to tell someone, the physician, that you're not safe, then I think there should be certainly a workaround. But the general posture of our system is that if you are under 18, you are a minor, you can't undergo a medical procedure without your parents' consent. Obviously, if you're emancipated, that's different. If there are workarounds, but that is the default rule in our system.
I just want to say you all asked a lot of questions.
There are a bunch of cards here.
Could I add? So that's exactly right. Parker's description of the state of the law is correct. I'm not trying to patronize you. I'm just trying to affirm you on that. Those parental consent or parental notification laws have been on the books in a lot of states since the 1980s. They were moved into law in part through a group called the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, which is a pay-to-play group where corporations or foundations pay to basically get their legislation into the hands of state legislators across the country. They vote secretly in task force meetings on these bills before they are introduced in state houses, and then they become law. And that parental consent or parental notification movement was driven through the American Legislative Exchange Council, which has been funded by some of the biggest corporations like Koch Industries, for a long time by Exxon, by the tobacco industry, and also by some of these right-wing foundations that have had this agenda. I think that the parental consent or parental notification laws, that idea of having an override, it's certainly the norm in the United States. I don't think it works very effectively for the kids involved. Getting the override for notification is very difficult for a child to pursue, and the time frame is difficult in terms of wanting to make the decision to terminate that pregnancy. And I think, as Kate said, and I don't have children, I have dogs. I confess, this is my reality. I love the dogs. But the reality is that if a child or a teenager, a 17-year-old, 15-year-old, what have you, has a good relationship with their parent, they will ask for their advice about what to do if they're pregnant. And if they don't have a safe environment, if they don't feel that they can bring this issue to their parents, I don't think the state should force them to do so. And if the state is going to force them to do so, as it does under these laws that have been affirmed under Roe versus Wade and that progeny, as not placing too much of an undue burden on these young people, I think those laws should be improved to make it easier if they're going to stay on the books, I think they should be improved because they've been shown to be very difficult for a person to navigate, and the clock is ticking for them to be able to have a safe abortion.
Thank you, Lisa. From another student, regardless of abortion, how can birth control for men and women become more accessible, less taboo, and more separated from abortion, i.e. the stigma toward Planned Parenthood, despite abortion only being part of that?
That is a great question. I'm really glad that somebody asked that. So when the first time that I accessed birth control as a teenager, I went to my local Planned Parenthood clinic to access it, right? And I'm so grateful that that was available, and it is such a travesty that that is not happening in so many places right now. So I want to speak to a couple things with this, because we are ostensibly talking about the role of men in this conversation, right? There is not birth control for men yet, right? And there are 3 different forms of male birth control that are in clinical trials right now. And in fact, we've seen a huge spike in men being willing to enroll in clinical trials for male contraceptives since 2022. Right, since the Dobbs decision. So there's an implant, there's a gel, and there's a pill that are or there's an implant and a gel, and I think then an injectable that are all in clinical trials, and at least one of them is non-hormonal. And they're showing some promising results. What is getting in the way of that happening? Well, I think the conversation hasn't brought men in enough. And there is not funding, right? The only reason that we have birth control, that the pill moved along in the way that it did, is because of a woman named Catherine McCormick. Okay. Sometimes we talk about the role of Pincus. He's the scientist who actually did the formulation for the pill. But the entire movement for the pill was bankrolled by a single woman who was incredibly rich. She had a millionaire husband who died, and she spent her life, actually after he died, when she was 75, she was writing the checks to Pincus to develop the birth control pill, single-handedly bankrolled the entire thing, and is the reason that we have it, right? Because who else was going to invest in that? Okay, so people are not investing in this for men, but this is something. So if this is interesting to you, especially I really want to speak directly to the young heterosexual men in this audience. If you are a young, not just young, if you are a heterosexual man who has sex with heterosexual women, this is information that you should know about. And you absolutely 1000% need to be thinking about your role and your responsibility, okay? Because let me tell you one thing. There's one thing in particular that men can control here. And I'm going to use really specific graphic terms right now. So FYI, we're going to talk about sex. You can control your ejaculation. You can control when and how you ejaculate. Women cannot control their ovulation. Okay? We can regulate it with hormonal treatments, with birth control, right? But a woman cannot control when and how exactly she ovulates. That is out of our control. Men can control their ejaculation, okay? That is on you. And in this conversation that we've been having for decades, we have not been thinking about it in those terms. So that is something that you can do, is you can literally think about that. There's also the option of vasectomy. Okay? Vasectomies are 99% effective and they're reversible, right? I really understand why a young man who wants to have children at some point in his life would be not enthusiastic about a vasectomy. I really understand that. Although, do you know what when surveys have been taken, the #1 reason that men don't want to get a vasectomy is? Anyone? Because it might hurt.
Welcome to our world.
Fear of pain and side effects. And I might sound like a jerk up here saying that, but that is actually the 40% of men, when polled, say that the main reason that they don't seek a vasectomy is because it might hurt. I've had 2 children. Let me tell you about pain. I get my period every month. I got my period this morning. I have cramps right now. It's painful. It happens to me every month, right? This is what women live with all of the time. And this is on all of us. I really believe in young people especially thinking about the responsibility that they have with their bodies. If they are going to involve in heterosexual intercourse, you absolutely have responsibility, but it cannot continue to just be on the part of the woman, right? The autonomy that birth control gave to women, right? And that is why birth control for women was so important, because it is about autonomy. They did not have to rely on men being the ones responsible. But we are at a point now where we have to switch that responsibility back and bring men into the conversation about it. So sign up for a clinical trial, dudes. My young bros, you could probably get paid to be in a clinical trial, actually. You need some post-college money? Check it out, go online.
I do think, first of all, there are bills in Congress, including bills sponsored by Republican women, to make birth control available over the counter without a prescription to lower that burden. And I think that's really smart, especially if you are, as a Republican, a pro-life person, then you should want greater access to birth control. I do think it's interesting that the pill actually shifted the burden of birth control back onto women in some ways. It was the man's responsibility prior to that. I'm not saying that the invention of the pill was a bad thing for that reason, but it is an interesting historical conversation to think about. It was the man's responsibility. It has shifted, and now I think it is wise to look at ways that it could shift back again. It ought to be shared, right? In an ideal world, it's a conversation between two people who are, about to do something very serious, and they should have a serious conversation, but I know that's not always the case.
I think that it's important to recognize where we are on this issue in this country from a legal standpoint, which is that in the Dobbs decision, you had a concurring opinion by Clarence Thomas asserting that what's up next is Griswold. So Griswold versus Connecticut is a decision from the early 1960s where the Supreme Court rejected a rule in Connecticut that required husbands to consent before their wife could get access to contraceptives. And if you didn't have a spouse, you couldn't get them at all. So Griswold set forth a recognition that one of the components of freedom is that right to bodily autonomy, the right to access contraception. And in that Dobbs decision, in taking down Roe and the way that Alito and the Republican appointees attacked Roe, basically unhinged the potential for them then to destroy Griswold, to overturn Griswold. Because in essence, what Clarence Thomas asserted was that if Roe will fall on this basis, then basically Griswold should fall too. And so do not be complacent. There is an ongoing effort to limit access to contraception in the United States. Part of that was very prominently displayed in Project 2025, the project that was advanced by the Heritage Foundation, whose groups that were part of this, their biggest funder was Leonard Leo, of course, the person who packed the court to overturn Roe versus Wade. Project 2025 is replete with attacks on both U.S. domestic and foreign policy regarding access to contraception. It specifically also advanced attacks to basically defund Planned Parenthood, whose primary actual activity in this country is providing access to clinics for OBGYN visits, for pap smears, and access to contraception. But it was targeted in that way. And within Project 2025 is this focus on abstinence-only education as opposed to real information about science and how contraceptions work and how people get pregnant and how to prevent pregnancy. And that abstinence-only education has been proven in study after study after study to be not as effective. Now, that's not saying that in an individual home of an adult woman in a married household who's like a practicing Catholic that they can't engage in the rhythm method. That's a personal choice. But teaching abstinence only or not teaching people about their reproductive health at all means that a lot of people are going to get pregnant unintentionally and not realize that they could have prevented that pregnancy. And this movement to attack access to contraception is very well funded. One of the main groups that's active in this is called Students for Life and Students for Life Action. It is deeply funded by Leonard Leo, and its leader aggressively attacks legal access to contraception. Another group that is deeply funded by Leonard Leo and some of these other right-wing billionaires like Dick Uihlein are Susan B. Anthony, Pro-Life America, which is also attacking not just access to abortion, but attacking this whole, the whole infrastructure of access to reproductive health care, including Planned Parenthood. So even though those, they have not been successful yet in limiting access to contraception, do not be unaware of the fact that that is also on the agenda of some of these very well-funded groups. And I will tell you, part of my work is to highlight the work of advocates in this arena, people who are advocating for protecting reproductive access, and I do so on the Midas Touch Network through our subchannel Legal AF, and also on my Substack Grave Injustice, where you can find out more about the groups that are behind this attack on our autonomy and our access to reproductive care.
Another student question. There are fears right now about depopulation or declining birth rates. How do you see that factoring in to regulation of reproduction and birth control?
I have to jump in first, can I? I've heard this claim, including by Rick Santorum, who was a U.S. Senator representing Pennsylvania, and who has been one of the staunch allies of SBA, Susan B. Anthony, and these other groups. And when he describes declining birth rate, the word that is not said out loud is white birth rate. Yeah. So I don't think we can have this conversation. Like, it's certainly the case, for example, globally. European birth rates are lower. In Japan, birth rates are lower. China, they've got the one-child policy that's mostly enforced. But in the Western democracies, there has been this question about, are there enough children basically to help maintain the social structure or pay into Social Security and the like? Meanwhile, some of the very groups that are attacking access to reproductive care are also attacking Social Security. So the sort of hypocrisy, or like how much they really care about like that social structure, I'll leave that for you to decide. But this question of declining birth rates and some of the right-wing writing around it and speeches around it, like Rick Santorum's, really are about concerns about how white women are not having enough children. And there's an actual program that we've helped write about and document and share with reporters about who's behind this movement. And interestingly, so when Rick Santorum was making these statements, he was saying to people, this was 2 years before Roe, I believe, was overturned in Dobbs, and they were already preparing, based on the Trump appointees to the Supreme Court, that there would be 6 Republican appointees that they would overturn Roe. Santorum was saying, in a post-Roe environment, they were already preparing ahead. They're going to need to have paid family medical leave because more women were going to be pregnant and need paid leave. And before then, the right-wing movement overall has been an opponent, an antagonist against paid leave, paid family leave. But because they were anticipating more white births, they suddenly had a part of their movement deciding to endorse access to paid family leave. Now, their paid family leave was, what's the technical word, crappy, because it actually had you borrow from your Social Security in order to have paid leave now, when women are already at a disadvantage in Social Security, both because of leaving the workforce and inherent continuing wage gaps for work. And then you would have women have less access to Social Security, lower Social Security payments later. But go ahead, Rick Santorum and his allies were saying, let's just have you borrow from your future Social Security to pay for the leave you're going to need for all the kids you're going to have post-Roe. And he didn't say white, but if you look at the actual birth rates in America, that is the population where birth rate is declining. And so I will not retract that statement under any circumstances.
We were told in the 1970s that we were going to have a massive population problem and the earth was too crowded and we needed to stop having kids. And that's actually been proven totally false. That's the guy who just was the main proponent of it, just died with all of his predictions unfulfilled. Countries do have, Korea has a serious economic problem. Japan has an economic problem. I'm not an expert on this issue, but I don't necessarily see this leading to any legislative outcomes, I guess.
Declining population is a white supremacist talking point.
Another question. Can you speak on the importance of separation of church and state? And if any, what role faith should play in policy making? I
will say, initially, I said that, that many lawmakers had a belief that life begins at conception. And, I think Kate specifically said, well, we can't make law on belief, which I agree with. There is a scientific basis for that belief, though. I mean, there is a mating of an egg and a sperm that creates a multicellular organism that those cells multiply, and it ultimately does become a baby. So I don't think we should be making law on religious beliefs. I use the word belief to symbolize that it was sort of deeply held and sincere, but I do think that there is an actual scientific basis for that position as well. But I don't think we should make laws based on religious beliefs of any sort.
I agree. I agree. And I'll just add that, this Constitution, there's the Declaration of Independence, and it's long because it's got other bodies of law in here, but, it specifically says that there shall be no religious test for office. It is a strong command in our Constitution that we not have a theocracy. That is, no religious test for office is a significant command. And the First Amendment specifically says that Congress shall make no law establishing religion. This Supreme Court, the Roberts Court, has been on a warpath to destroy that separation. It has issued numerous decisions over the last few years, dismantling those separate realms, and allowing basically religious indoctrination to come through public dollars, through our tax dollars. When in fact, if you look at the other constitutions that are in here from the Commonwealth of Virginia and other states as they entered the United States, they were very clear about one of the things that was most offensive to the founding generation was the idea that they were living in colonies that were often dominated by a particular religion, and they were taxed to support those churches. And so within other contemporary constitutional provisions in the states, there were even more explicit descriptions of non-establishment that was basically designed to say you can't tax people to enforce a particular religion or to force the subsidy of a particular religion. But this court is dismantling those rules rapidly in ways that we are now subsidizing religious indoctrination. I believe that people, should have full freedom in their own beliefs. Freedom of conscience is one of the most amazing, transformations, advances in human history, to have that freedom of belief, the freedom of worship, to worship as you choose or not. And our Constitution endeavors to protect that. Unfortunately, this Roberts Court, along with some of the groups, again, I know I'm just a wheel on this, Leonard Leo is funding some of those groups too, to assail that separation of church and state. And I definitely think people should be able to have those beliefs about their lives and their faith, but I just don't think that it's consistent with freedom to impose your religious beliefs on someone else as a matter of binding law.
I'll just say briefly, just as a respectful pushback, that baby is not a scientific term when we're talking about pregnancy and reproduction. The term is fetus. So a lot of the times when we have conversations or debates about life beginning at conception, again, that is not a scientific debate. That's a linguistic and a cultural and often religious conversation. But in terms of the science and the way that healthcare professionals will talk about it, they're not going to use the term baby to talk about a fertilized egg or a fetus. Also, it's just worth noting that our current president thinks he is both Jesus and a doctor, apparently. So talk about the intersection of science, medicine, and religion. So apparently, that he was told, they now think that he was told that he was supposed to say the image was doctored. Because that's what his spokesperson went out and said. It was a doctored image, but it is likely that he thought that they said doctored. Can't make this stuff up, people.
Okay, here's a question, and I want to get back to your discussion about the fact that there are some things, drugs that are in the pipeline for men that I was certainly not aware of. But here's a question. How do we hold men as a key half of sexual acts more accountable for their role? And then it's mentioned sexual violence, the spread of STDs, but also paternal responsibility for care, support, et cetera. And I think there are probably very many men in the audience who would accept that they have half responsibility. So why don't we have those conversations? Why isn't that news out there? What can culture or the public do about that?
Have more conversations about this specifically. Ask your guy friends their opinions, right? Again, if you're a man in here, bring this up with other men. Talk about it, post about it, read a book about it. I want to recommend a couple books. One is, I think, for parents or grandparents. There's a really good book that came out this year by, his name is Christopher Pepper, and it's called Talk to Your Boys. And it's a really good book, I just think, for any parent or any caregiver invested in raising young men right now. And it is about sex, but it is also about talking about toxic masculinity and violence and video games and screens and porn and all of these things. Again, I'm a parent. I have a daughter. I also have a son and a stepson who thus far seem very heteronormative, and these are conversations that I am having with them. There's also a book, I mentioned the idea about controlling your ejaculation, and that comes in part, there's a writer named Gabrielle Blair, and she has a book called Ejaculate Responsibly. She's a Mormon mother of 6, and is a very outspoken, pro-choice kind of thinker, but she is interested in reframing the conversation again about the responsibility of men when it comes to this. So I think anytime we have a question of how do we get more people X, Y, and Z, I mean, part of the answer is to talk about it, right? I mean, I understand that it's not like a cool, fun topic to bring up at parties, but that this is one of the ways that we create change is by these things that we care about, figuring out ways to work it into our conversations. Maybe it's you go and you talk to your brother or your boyfriend or your partner or a guy that you know or your dad, and you're like, wow, I went to this talk this morning and here's what people were talking about. What do you think, right? We don't have time, but I would love to ask every single man in here, what do you think, right? Again, I, as a person who's been a public, outward-facing feminist for a long time, I'm constantly asked for my opinion on these matters, and I'm happy to give them. But I very much want to, and let me be clear, I've spent my life hearing men talk to me about their opinions about things. I don't necessarily want more male opinions on a lot of things, but on this topic, I actually really do.
I think that men get a bad rap some of the time. I will say I am pro-man, pro-woman, pro-LGBTQ, trans rights, and I think most people are humane people, are thoughtful people. I think sex scares a lot of people, and not having adequate education about sexuality scares people. I'd love to see t-shirts that say consent is sexy. There was a movement during the 2024 election of young men wearing t-shirts about being pro-choice or pro-contraceptive, and I just think there needs to be ways in which we are talking about some of this a little more publicly, a little more openly, and that I think that would help a lot. And I also just think that, there are things that we have taken in society that we accept as proper frames that aren't. And I'm going to just take a bit of a tangent, but I'll come back, which is during the Brett Kavanaugh nomination, which I was fighting mightily to stop his confirmation, one of the things that really struck me was this notion of false accusation. And I think when you look at that, and it's so across the board, this fear of false accusation, I would say to you, the real problem we have in America is false denial. That's the reality, is that almost any man who is accused of rape or sexual assault or date rape denies it. And those denials are mostly false. Not always. They could be falsely accused. But instead, culturally, we have this notion that it's the woman who somehow has some axe to grind. I just wrote a piece that I put on Substack yesterday about Peter Thiel. He wrote this book, Challenging Multiculturalism in Universities. And in the book, he suggested that date rape was just regret by young women on campus. He later retracted that, apologized for it, but we have a problem in this country, and on college campuses in particular, where if you look at the number of women who in surveys describe themselves of having been raped or date raped or roofied, that results in actually, it's not just one guy on campus, it's a lot of guys on campus, not a majority. But then it's a question of how much do these other men tolerate that behavior? And so coming back to the question of contraception, of responsible sexual activity, we need to have conversations in which guys in the locker room or at the frat are holding each other accountable for their actions if they are trying to take advantage of a young woman, or they want to get them drunk to have sex with them without wearing a condom, without consent. Obviously, that's the primary factor. But it's a real question of human accountability to each other, and a lot of that really comes through parents, I think, having conversations with their kids about what it means to be a human and treat another person as a human, what consent means, what love means, what lust means, and having hard conversations that a lot of people still aren't comfortable having.
Well, we just have 4 minutes left. And first of all, I'd like to thank all of you who submitted questions. We got a lot of great questions, and I think many of your questions were addressed by our great panelists, so thank you so much. I would like to give you all a chance to just kind of summarize any comments. And just one last thought that is, I think, very personal in nature. There's a question about what advice do you have for women who are starting to navigate family planning for the first time in this climate, where they might not feel like they have all the choices available to them? So if you could incorporate that into your final comments, and then and I'd like to thank you, the audience, and also thank our panelists for a really great session.
I'll go first because I'm right here. It seems logical. Well, I want to thank everybody for being here. And I do want to say that if you have a question that didn't get answered, this is such an important topic. I'll be right here afterwards. I'm happy to continue this conversation with anybody who wants to talk more on any of these ideas, especially if you're a student. I'll still talk to you if you're not a student, but student priority. I think to summarize again, I think it's to go back to just like the premise of the panel, which is this row, if not row then Joe, this bringing in of men. I mentioned at the beginning that I would love to see panels about toxic masculinity and male violence and rape culture with men on. I mean, there's a horrific piece that just came out on CNN right now about this like online rape academy where the undercover investigators went in, and all of these men going into these online spaces and trading tips on how to drug and rape their wives. And I'm sorry if this is horrific to hear about, but it's true. Like, this is the stuff that happens, and we have to have men in these conversations talking about it, talking to each other. I don't know how frats work. I went to a hippie college. We didn't have them, but I'm really curious. What is the education? What kind of conversations? What work is being done there to talk about date rape, to talk about consent, to talk about safety? I hope that that's happening. So I would say, though, for people who are interested, you can go online. There is an organization called the Male Contraception Initiative or Institute. Acronyms are hard. There's an I at the end. MCI, Male Contraception Institute, that is doing a lot of the research and funding for male contraception. And for those who are interested in continuing to follow reproductive rights policy and legislation, I really recommend, in addition to Lisa's work with tracking the Supreme Court, there's a Substack newsletter called Abortion Every Day. And it's by Jessica Valenti. She's a longtime feminist journalist, and she has a small team of people who write a very, very focused weekly newsletter. It's journalism. They are just tracking what are the different bills in different states, what is happening in all of the states, and in this time of so much information chaos, where we are just being bombarded by breaking news every day. I really appreciate Jessica's work with Abortion Every Day because it is super specific and it is consistent. So if that is something where you want to have just access to what is going on with this, you can subscribe for free, or you can pay them a little, which would be great because they're hardworking journalists. Yeah.
I appreciate being part of this conversation. If I don't stay after, it's because I'm on a panel almost immediately after this about free and fair elections, so that should be fun too. No, I appreciate the respectful nature of this conversation on some very, difficult topics. To the question about sort of family planning, I was on a panel earlier, and it was also all women, and we were asked what brings us joy, and every single one of us said our children. And so I think that is is an important part to remember as, you know, if you are embarking on this journey, that to embrace that joy. And, you know, that is what is the end goal of all of this. So thank you again for your response.
Parker and I were sharing some trepidation before the panel began, but it's very nice to meet you, Parker, and it was great to have this panel, Jan, that you've hosted so ably, and to have your questions. You know, I think that one of the important things, if you're just, you know, trying to experience the world as a human, this question of sexuality, of sex is can be daunting. There are lots of guides and helpful tools. Having a good doctor, having a doctor you go to or a clinic that you go to regularly you can talk to about anything is really, really important, because there's a lot of things that are just hard to know or hard to navigate. I would also say there's a lot of advice coming through Jessica, Jessica Valenti and others who we've had on our Legal AF show, talking about, you know, the possibility of stocking up on Miffy, at least having it accessible to you in case you need that medicine, so you don't have to go to extremes to try to get it in this panic state when you don't know, did you miss your period or are you pregnant, and that uncertainty as the clock is ticking, you know, so you can take some preventative measures. So I would say, you know, stock up on that, but don't stock up on condoms because they do expire. But you should have them. You should have them. I think every woman who is of reproductive age or capacity should have a condom available for them. When they look at the abstinence-only education, one of the things they see is that the people who are most likely to get pregnant are the people who say they're never going to have sex. So they're not prepared. They don't have a condom ready when they're in the heat of passion with their boyfriend, and they don't have any protection, and they go for it in the hopes, or they pull out, which is a highly ineffective method, you know, documented this way. But young girls and college women and adult women sometimes think, you know, it's too irresistible, and they chance it. So just make sure you have condoms, that people who are of reproductive age have condoms. And I would say, I would urge any young person here to watch the documentary, The Janes. It's a really important documentary about the period before Roe v. Wade and how women were banding together to try to help each other get access to abortion in the terrible criminalization period that the country was in pre-1973, 72. And it's worth understanding why this has been such a big fight, why so many women my age and older than my age have fought so hard for your right to have access to abortion, even though I don't need one. That ship has sailed. Not that you needed to know that, but in the spirit of forthrightness. But we are so for the young people out there, men, women, whatever your gender is, we are fighting for your health, for your choice, for your destinies.
Thank you to all of you for coming, especially the students for submitting so many great questions, and thanks for being at CWA. Thank you to our panelists. Wonderful job.
Thank you so much.